Why don't a couple of you get over here for you. Good morning. I'm Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, and my privilege is to introduce the Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke. He will introduce superintendents from our national parks, and then we have a few distinguished senators here who will have remarks to make, and Congressman Simpson from Idaho hopefully will join us during the time. You know, it's hard to get in the United States Senate. It's hard to stay in the United States Senate. And what we're about to announce today is one of the reasons it's worthwhile to be here. I'd like to ask everybody here to step back and consider the significance of this, because it has considerable significance. Because what we're announcing today is a bipartisan proposal supported by the President of the United States and the Office of Management and Budget that works for him, that over the next 10 years could eliminate the $11.6 billion deferred maintenance backlog in the 417 national parks of our country. Half that backlog is roads, and so when the roads are paved properly or maintained properly, that money can be used for other needs in the parks. In the Great Smoky Mountains, where I'm from, 75% of the backlogs is roads, more than $220 million. And to show you the significance of this, we would never get the backlog taken care of. We'd always be bleeding from other parts of the park budget to take care of it if we didn't do what Secretary Zinke and the President have proposed. Because the annual appropriations for the parks is, the deferred maintenance backlog is 4 times the amount of the annual appropriation for the park. Everyone who cares about the national parks should welcome this proposal by the Secretary. While it's unprecedented in the sense that never before has the President recommended using revenues from energy on federal lands as mandatory spending for deferred maintenance in the national parks, the principle of taking an environmental burden and making an environmental benefit is a well-established one. President Johnson's Outdoor Commission on Commission on Americans Outdoors in the 1960s, headed by Lawrence Rockefeller, recommended creating the Land and Water Conservation Fund to be paid for by drilling on federal lands and using some of the revenues to pay for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And over the years, $18 billion have been used for that purpose. We repeated that principle again in 2006 when the Congress and the President approved taking some revenues from drilling in the Gulf and using it for the state side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. In 1986, I chaired President Reagan's Commission on Americans Outdoors. And again, we recommended taking money from drilling on federal lands and using it for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So while this is the first time it's been done in a mandatory way on national park lands, it's a well-established principle we all should welcome. So not only does this have the support of the President, it has bipartisan support in the United States Senate. In addition to the senators who are here today, Democratic Senators Angus King, Martin Heinrich, and Joe Manchin are 3 Democratic senators who support the legislation. I'm sure there will be more. So this is an unprecedented proposal. Ken Burns said the national parks are America's best idea. This is the best idea to improve the national parks that I've heard of. And I'm delighted that Secretary Zinke asked all of us to join him in recommending to the Senate. And it's my pleasure to present the Secretary of Interior, who has persuaded the Office of Management and Budget to do something nobody thought they would ever do, Secretary Ryan Zinke.
Thanks. And thanks for your leadership on this. And our parks. Our parks are part of Americans' treasures. And this is unprecedented. It's probably the greatest, if not one of the greatest, investments in the history of this country in public lands. And there isn't anyone I've ever met that doesn't love our parks. But our parks are challenged. They're being loved to death. We have $11.6 billion backlog. About half of that's our roads. But as you enter parks, Americans deserve to have a park system that's well-funded, that's well-operated, and the visitor experience of our parks should remain sacred. I brought with me our 4 superintendents that are here to ask questions from Acadia and the Smokies and Grand Canyon and the Mall, here to answer questions on how bad it is. Just in the Mall, many of you are from Washington, D.C., it's probably about an $800 million backlog. Some it's the seawalls, but we're doing construction this summer. But these are the treasures in the Mall of monuments that serve as our nation's indicator of how important our history is. And then you go further west, the larger park systems there, when you have the water problem in the Grand Canyon, where we're having to repair a pipe 30 times, I think just last year. You have Acadia, the traffic, the bike trails need to be redone, the Smokies, the roads, and it goes on and on and on. But I'd like to say this again is unprecedented in scale. As the President is committed to making sure that we put the money and the investment long term, and it is all energy. It is not just oil and gas. The LWFCU program is primarily gas offshore. Every source of energy has a consequence on federal land. Wind certainly chops up birds. Solar removes habitat. And when you put the large solar fields on federal land, then that means that land is not available for hunting or recreation, and it's tough on habitat. Every source of energy has its consequences, certainly oil and gas and carbon. But it's a fair proposition to say if you're going to raise wealth on public lands, primarily offshore and BLM, it's a fair proposition that you should also invest in the future of public lands, particularly in our parks. So again, thank you for your leadership on this, and this is a bipartisan. Our parks are not Republican or Democrat or independent. Our parks are red, white, and blue. And I think as a great nation, as great as ours, then we should also contribute to the greatness of our parks. So with that, Senator Daines, I'm going to turn it over to my favorite senator from Montana.
Thank you, Secretary Zinke. I'm proud to stand here today with another Montana boy, and Secretary Zinke. We both grew up in Montana. Secretary Zinke and I were Boy Staters together in 1979. He from Whitefish High and I from Bozeman High. Ryan Zinke grew up in the shadows of Glacier National Park. I grew up in the shadows of Yellowstone National Park. And I want to thank Senator Alexander for his leadership, working with Secretary Zinke in pulling together a bipartisan solution for this challenge that we face in the backlog in our national parks. Well, the good news is we love our national parks. The bad news is we love our national parks. We're loving them almost to death as we face infrastructure challenges. I get to our national parks very frequently. My wife and I always get the pass. And when you drive down to Yellowstone National Park, which is just an hour and a half from my home, I've been driving down there either with my family back in the 1960s or now as a dad myself. Used to be you could find a place to park. Used to be you didn't have to worry about pulling off on the side of the road because there were no parking places. The problem we have now in Yellowstone National Park, there's places, the parking lot's full. You pull off the side of the road, there's not even a shoulder to park on. So the roads are struggling. The infrastructure is struggling. Water, sewer, employee housing. It's time to act. The number of visitors to Yellowstone National Park continues to grow. We had over 4 million visitors there last year. We're setting records in terms of visitation. Why is that important? It's important for our outdoor economy in Montana. It's about a $7 billion economy. And one of the primary drivers of that is our national parks. This $11.6 billion backlog has to be taken care of. Congress is rightfully accused of kicking the can down the road all the time. We have a chance this moment to step forward and address this issue for future generations. And again, I'm proud and thankful for the leadership of Secretary Zinke, Senator Alexander. Let's get this done.
Thank you. We have 12 sites in Colorado that are administered by the National Park Service. Most of us as children have a memory, many of us have memories across the country of Rocky Mountain National Park and our experiences in great places like Estes Park. But whether it's the Great Sand Dunes National Park, whether it's Black Canyon of the Gunnison Rocky Mountain National Park, or even the Camp Amachi internment site in southeastern Colorado, we have an opportunity with this legislation to do a generational favor in terms of funding the backlog that has crippled our national park system. It's time that we share a little love with our beloved national parks, and that's what this legislation, this bipartisan legislation, will do. It's not just the monuments that we build, it's not just the buildings that we create, but future generations will judge us by our treasured outdoors and how we leave that legacy of wonder and environment to our children and grandchildren. And that's what this legislation allows us to do, to continue to build a legacy of the past for generations in the future.
Sorry, I was a little late. Don't read anything into that except this is an important day, I think, as my colleagues have said and Secretary Zinke expressed. We have 2 national parks in the little state of West Virginia, and one very close to here, and that's Harpers Ferry National Park, which has hundreds of thousands of visitors. It's a beautiful, historic, very important to our nation's history. And the restoration, the preservation, and some of the maintenance backlog we need to address, and I think that's what this bill does. We also have the New River Gorge National River. Great rafting. I hope all of you all have taken a chance to see the beauty of our state of West Virginia. But so I wanted to kind of have a little East Coast, smaller national park view and support of how important this is to our families, but also to our nation's history. The preservation of the history that we see in our national parks is absolutely critical to our next generations. And I'm really proud to be a part of this. And Senator Alexander's, I thank you for your leadership, as always, and I look forward to a success with this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Alexander. Every time you do something positive up here, it makes me feel even better about having voted for you as governor back when I was a new voter in the state of Tennessee. I've had the opportunity to live in Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina and see the Great Smoky Mountain National Park from virtually every side. I spend a lot of time up there. I actually got involved in politics because of a park project that I was trying to get done in the town that I lived in at the time. I thank you for your leadership. The way that Senator Alexander goes about making a difference makes me very confident that we will get this bill through Congress and to the President's desk. The other reason why I'm convinced that we will is because we have a great secretary. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you publicly for the great work he's done. He's one of the most responsive members of the cabinet. They're all good, but he's really good. He's responded to our needs here, and I know with his active engagement in this process, we're going to get this done. We're going to make a great impact. And finally, I just want to thank the superintendents for the great work you do in being stewards of our national treasures. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Now, we'll be glad to take questions of the Secretary or members of the park superintendents. Yes, sir. Mr. Secretary.
So over the past year with some of the lease sales, there's been tepid industry response. How confident are you that this will generate the funds that you're predicting it will? And is there any other revenue sources you think that can go into the fund, just especially with this kind of oil glut we are currently experiencing?
Well, it's just not oil and gas. It's all energy. It's just not oil and gas. It's all energy produced on public lands. Where we are in oil and gas, we are at 10.6 million barrels a day. We are the first time in 60 years we're exporting liquid natural gas. So a lot of what Interior did last year was relighting the pilot light for American energy. We have been successful in that. And now it's time to do a pivot and focus on conservation and preservation of our principal assets, which are our park system and public lands. So I'm fairly confident that we will continue to use energy. Liquid natural gas will continue to play, as well as there's opportunity for wind offshore. But this is a broad energy sweep across the board, somewhat different than LWCF on there. But I'm fairly confident that we can get there with it. But this is mandatory spending, so a big difference than what previously has been proposed.
The senators, what is the path forward on this? Obviously, it's working this
Well, we still get our paychecks during election years, so we should be working. If there were one issue that unites the country and therefore the United States Senate, it would be support for our national park system. And I think the sponsors of this bill are a pretty good indication of that. We have two prominent Democrats, one prominent independent, several prominent Republicans, and the President of the United States. That's a pretty good start. So we can start with that. We'll go to the Energy Committee. And there's also a piece of relevant legislation that Senator Portman, Senator Warner have introduced, which is similar to this. My view is we put all those into the Energy Committee, work with Senator Murkowski and Cantwell, who are also interested in national parks, and make this a signature victory for the American people during 2018. I think there's a very good prospect.
And if I can add, the recreation industry itself is, depends on different figures, is somewhere around $800 billion a year. About $39 billion is in our parks alone. But the industry here, there's not a state that doesn't have a recreation industry. And there's not an individual or a state that doesn't have people that go to our parks and participate in it. So we think this is a very strong bipartisan effort. Certainly people love our outdoors, but a recreation, 99% of the RVs are made in America, primarily in Indiana. You have about 95% of our boats are made in the U.S., a lot of the Gulf. And boats and RVs and backpacks and shoes and all those type of things are part of a larger recreation industry, which rely on our public lands and state lands to do that. So this should be a bipartisan movement, and people forget that economics is also a driver, and make sure that the recreation industry remains healthy too. Let me make it absolutely clear. We are 100% aligned with the President's policy. The court itself said that we had to change our process, but the policy remains the same. We are 100% aligned with the President's policy. Well, it should have been more. I agree with you. But I'll defer.
Senator Gardner.
We're going to beat them.
Well, on that, that's a serious question. I'm co-sponsor, for example, of legislation that will be introduced to use funds for state wildlife agencies. I worked in 2006 to provide money from the Gulf for the state side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, chaired a commission to recommend that we do more of that. This is my #1 priority for conservation, and I think it will be for all of us here. So we'll do this first, and then we'll do the rest of it.
One last question, this gentleman back here.
Thank you. For the Secretary, you made a comment about providing 750,000 birds a year. Your agency's data found it was actually less than half of that, and that's still far more. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, we're looking at the USGS and there's multiple studies. What we can agree on, that every energy source has a consequence. And if you go outside of Las Vegas, you look at the solar area there, they call them streamers, that the solar cells and the solar field there eliminates a lot of birds. Don't have the numbers on it, but same thing with wind and solar and nuclear. All energy itself has a consequence. And certainly oil and gas and coal has a consequence too. So I think it's a fair proposition is if you're gaining wealth through energy on public lands, that wealth, some of it goes back to preserving, protecting, and leading to our maintenance of those public lands. That is a fair and noble proposition. Thanks.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to the senators for coming. Thank you.